Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Macmillan International Webinar. My name is Helen Kolesnik and I'm greeting you from Kiev, Ukraine. Being asked to introduce our presenter of the webinar is an honor for me. So, Czesław Kinski is a university teacher and has experience in teaching all levels and all age groups. He is a teacher trainer and course book co-author. He's been teaching for 20 years, and moreover, he has been a Cambridge ESOL examiner for about 15 years. So I think it's more than enough to believe how practical our webinar is going to be today. Now, Czesław, your word.
Yeah, thank you very much, Helen, for this welcome, and hello to everyone. I can see that you're already beginning to answer my first question. As you know, the first question in the first exam is, where are you from? So could you quickly type the name of the town and the short code for the country you come from, so that we can all see what the community we are forming today? Oh, this is great. So while you're typing, I'll introduce the structure of the session. We're basically dealing with two parts today. We'll talk about the marking criteria for the first exam, and then I'm going to use the examination structure as an overview to give you some practical tips and tricks that you can pass on to your students. So this is basically the structure. There are just two parts. We're going to spend about 45 minutes on that. If there are any questions, feel free to type them in, and if we have time at the end of the session, we will answer some of them. I know that a webinar is not as interactive as a face-to-face presentation. That's why I have prepared this for you. Every time you can see this, could you please type in a smiley? Because I don't know if you're reacting or not, and I can see you are, which is great. So you've known the structure of the meeting. You know something about me. There will be a few polls during this session, which I will kindly ask you to answer. And I guess it's time to get started. So here is our first poll. How long have you been teaching for first? Can you quickly answer the poll so we can see the results? Okay, this is great. So I guess, yeah, just let me remind you to answer the poll in the poll box, not in the chat box, because I guess we're getting like multiple answers in two different boxes. So you need to answer this, in the poll box. We can see the percentages of people answering the questions. Okay. All right. Um, So it seems you've got like varied experience. We have teachers, over half of the teachers who've been teaching for this examination for more than 5 years, but also quite a number of new teachers. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the marking criteria, and well, we're going to go through these step by step. So there are four. There is grammar and vocabulary, there is discourse management, there is pronunciation, and interactive communication. Now, if I ask you to share with me the following things, do you know what's tested in each of these? So do you know perfectly? Do you think you know more or less? Do you have a brief or like a vague idea of something, or you know nothing about this? Okay, so it seems that yeah, we're getting numbers, and as I expected, there are among us there are people with varied experience. So I'm going to discuss each of these, one by one so that we all have an idea of what's tested. And by telling you this, I would like you to inform your students as well so that they know exactly well, the things they should do in the exam. So first of all, grammar and vocabulary. This is perhaps the well, the thing that we all associate with the exam. But there are three things to it: accuracy, range, and appropriacy. So I don't know about the countries where you come from, but in Poland, teachers are quite strict about accuracy, which is both the grammatical and the lexical precision that the students need to show in order to pass this examination. But let's not forget the fact that this is an examination at the B2 level, which means that the accuracy that's being tested at this level is still what's required of level B2. Okay, so it's like how precise, how accurate your students are. Also, there's the range, which means that if students make attempts at using, for example, conditionals or reported speech, this sort of improves their grammar and vocabulary mark as well. Because, you know, technically, it's possible to go through the whole examination using the present simple and the past simple perfectly. In this situation, your accuracy mark is quite high, but your range mark is quite low. On the other hand, we all teach students who try and make attempts at very advanced and very ambitious language samples, but sometimes they fail. As a result of this, you know, some other students might be afraid to try something more ambitious. But in this examination, what's tested is both accuracy and range, and attempts at more ambitious language also get good marks. Okay, so appropriacy. You know, sometimes students in Poland, and I guess it's like an international phenomenon, sometimes students will try and rehearse some language before the exam, only to show off. Is this your experience? That's, by the way, a yes/no question which you can answer quickly. Sometimes. Thank you, Jacek. So, when they rehearse this language, sometimes they use it in inappropriate moments. So you need to tell your students that it's not only accuracy, it's not only grammatical correctness that's being tested, but also range. So they should try and use varied structures and different lexical items. But all of this has to be sufficiently appropriate for B2 level, which means that if something has been prepared beforehand and it isn't going to work, they should perhaps stay away from this, as it's going to sound inappropriate. So, do we have a clear idea of what's required in grammar and vocabulary? Yeah, thank you. So let's move on. So the next thing is discourse management, which, you know, briefly, discourse management is the logical arrangement of your answer. And here, as you can see, there are again three sub-criteria. The extent, so whether the answers that our students provide are developed, or whether they just short one-word answers. And at this level, students should not require too much prompting. So, for example, if you ask them the question about what they like doing in the free time, and they reply with a single word answer like computer games, or it's like a two-word answer, in fact, uh, of course, the examiner will prompt them from time to time, but at this level, they're expected not to be prompted after every question. There's also relevance, which once again, you need to tell your students that, you know, preparing little speeches won't work unless they get exactly the same question as what they have practiced at home. Finally, coherence and cohesion, so moving from idea to idea using linking devices. We all teach this in writing, but it's just as important in speaking. Okay, so far, grammar, vocabulary, and discourse management. And we're moving on to pronunciation. And once again, Polish teachers are quite keen on teaching pronunciation, quite keen on testing that. And when they think about top marks in pronunciation, they think about perfect native speaker. Whereas in fact, this is still pronunciation at level B2. And when you read the description by the Common European Framework of Reference, you will find that sometimes traces of L1 might be visible. So it's, in other words, to put it simply, it's possible to get a top mark, 5 out of 5, in the first exam, with language one still being evident. So if a student speaks with an accent, be it Polish, Ukrainian, Romanian, or something else, uh, but is understood, and connects words and stresses words appropriately, they can still get top marks. What we sometimes forget to teach, I think, as teachers, is the stress of words, because sometimes, stress will play a very important role in um, in what you say. So what's tested is also using stress to convey meanings. For example, when your students talk about their family and themselves, stressing individual items might bring out certain meanings. For example, I don't play football, but my brother does. And finally, individual sounds. Okay, so it's a combination of individual sounds, stress, and intonation. And so we need to teach our students. Again, lots of my students struggle with questions that very often their questions don't rise at the end, and they should. Okay, and last but not least, there's the interactive communication. And in this criterion, there are basically three things to inform your students of. So when they interact with each other, especially in part three, they should pay attention to initiate, to respond, and to develop the interaction. So when they discuss a certain problem, when they discuss a task, they should encourage the other person to speak. They should respond appropriately to what the other person is saying, um, whether it's the examiner or the other candidate, doesn't really matter, but they have to respond appropriately. But it's also great if they make steps to develop the interaction. So if they encourage the other person to say something when the interaction between them is failing. So as you can see, out of these four criteria, I think two of them are purely linguistic, grammar and vocabulary and pronunciation, whereas interactive communication and discourse management is sometimes a feature of personality. And I think it's important to stress this to our students. Um, so in my experience, teachers in Poland focus a lot on pronunciation, grammar and vocabulary, but we sometimes tend to forget how important communication and discourse management is. Would you say this is your experience as well? Yes, great. So, as you can see, this is about half of your grade. So, half of your grade depends on how successful you get your ideas across and how logically you organize them. So, I think it just can't be overlooked. Okay, as we can see, it's mostly a yes with a few differences. Okay, so now we are aware of the criteria that we can sort of, pass on to our students. Uh, so. Now, when you think about speaking tests and you think about the majority of your students, I would like you to ask another question, which is going to take me a while to type in. Okay, so here we are. Again, this might be a cultural thing, but I guess most students are not very happy about uh, spoken testing, right? When you think about the numbers of students that you teach, would you say that most of them are happy to take speaking tests and they welcome every opportunity? Or would you say that, they sort of feel neutral about this? Yeah, so as we can see, uh, so about 80% of you are choosing the last answer. Let me just remind you once again to answer the questions in the poll box, not in the chat box. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think that the speaking test is going to be easier and is going to be less stressful when your students know what is required of them, which we have already talked about. And second, if they know what is required of them in every part, like what's going to happen, if they will have gone through the exam procedures a number of times before they take the actual exam, I think they're going to be less stressed, less anxious, or less nervous. I'm not saying that they will never be stressed again, but we can substantially reduce the stress. I think all of us have the experience of the driving test. If you know what's going to be tested, you can prepare for this. And I think we're going to spend the large part of, well, the second part of the seminar talking about, well, the parts. Okay, so this is the exam structure. As you can see, there are 4 parts. The first one is personal questions. It's about 2 minutes long. Then there's the individual long turn, which is about 4 minutes. In this part, the students have a chance to talk on their own. And then there's the collaborative task, in which the students have to discuss something together and find a solution to a problem. This is about 4 minutes. And finally, there's part 4, which is a follow-up to part 3 based on the same subject, in which the students are asked questions from the examiner, just like in part 1. Okay, so good news about this examination is that it's fully scripted, which means that no examiner can ever deviate from the rubrics, from the script. And I think this is also safe to our students, because if the whole examination is scripted, it only contains the language that students are expected to know at this level, which means that it's rather impossible for your students to see any lexical items or to hear any lexical items, any vocabulary, any grammar that they might not have been taught beforehand. And I think this is good news, isn't it? Would you agree? Yeah, an actual question. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you very much. Okay, this always makes me feel a bit more needed. Okay, so it's fully scripted and contains very simple language. So, part 1. Now, which part of the examination would you say is the most stressful to the student? Part 3, collaboration, part 3, part 3. Okay. Yes, and we'll deal with these. Well, my students have also said that it's the beginning of the exam, where they haven't still got used to it. And I think the good news is that your students can prepare for part 1 perfectly, because what you can see is a sample of the examination downloaded from the Cambridge examinations website. In other words, your students can find out and get to know the questions that will be asked in the first 2 minutes. And I think if you can reduce the stress in the first 2 minutes, if you can be successful as a student in the first 2 minutes, you're quite likely to relax a bit later on and deal with the rest of the examination. Because if you sort of fail to answer a question at the beginning, this sort of sets your thinking for the rest of the exam. And if you're successful for the first 2 minutes, if you're fluent for the first 2 minutes, then perhaps this might be a sort of encouragement for you, well, to keep going. So your students can download this, or you can download this for your students, and you can practice these questions beforehand. Now, of course, one thing is important. Your students will need to strike a balance between answering these questions in a spontaneous way and being prepared to answer these questions. So as you can see, one of the questions is, how do you like to spend your evenings? And then there are additional prompts. If anybody needs the prompt, as I said before, the students are supposed to speak without being prompted. And at this stage, I think it's important to tell your students that they have to prepare their answers, but they also have to give them sort of naturally. So in the place where I come from, which is in the north of Poland, lots of students answer the first question, where are you from? Many of them will say something like Olsztyn, name of town. Obviously, this isn't enough. Would you agree? Yes. Then there's also another possibility. Some students will say something like Olsztyn, and I was born here, which is just great. But what's really interesting is that quite a number of students get into a little prepared speech about Olsztyn, and they tell us stories about Olsztyn, that is the capital of the area, and the area is the land of 1,000 lakes, but in fact we have more lakes than this. By the way, yeah, you could react perhaps. And, at this level, you need to tell your students that it's a balance between knowing what to say, but also being quite natural about this. So you extend your answers as much as needed. On the other hand, as you can see, some of these questions are quite predictable. Like, tell us about a film you really like. And believe it or not, in my experience as an examiner, as a teacher as well, I've heard students who've been learning English for something like 6 or 7 years, and when they got the question like this, tell me about a film you really like, they said something like, film, I don't know. I never really thought about this. So my question is, what have you been talking about in your English lessons? Because I think this is all we talk about with our teenage students and adults as well. So once again, these are well quite predictable questions, simple questions. So your students need to practice them, but in the exam itself, they need to deliver the answers with with some kind of fluency, and that's basically it. If you read the whole set of questions for this part, you will see that all the questions in this part use three grammatical structures: past simple, present simple, and going to, which I think is again good news. And once again, it shows the importance of teaching, the S endings, ED endings, etc. Okay? So if you work with a good book for first, and in my experience, I found the book by Roy Norris very successful because they're quite engaging and also very well planned in terms of the examination structure. You will see a lot of opportunities for preparing your students for part one. And also, you'll find lots of those little help boxes or tips that somehow become neglected by many teachers. Because as a teacher trainer, I have a chance to observe lots of students as well, and lots of teachers. And I see that teachers teach language, but they sometimes forget to prepare their students for the examination in terms of what's going to happen, what's tested and what's not tested. So as you can see, it's not about memorizing sentences. It's about extending, but also about being natural. Okay? Thank you for your comments, by the way. And okay, so it's time to move on. And I would like to suggest one simple exercise with your students. And I call this exercise, What's Your Point? So what you do is basically you take out questions from the course book, and you divide your students into groups like A and B, and the A student gets the questions and has to answer them. Student B has no idea of the questions and has to guess the questions from what student A is saying. You understand the idea? Great. So this way, I think, well, this exercise is good for two reasons. First of all, your students have to focus on providing a clear answer, like a clear message to this question. And second of all, the student who has to write down the question can also practice questions. Because, again, the structure of Polish is that students who speak English think that questions in English are just affirmative statements with a different intonation sometimes. So they forget auxiliaries like do, does, or did. Does this happen to your students as well in your languages? Yes, sometimes. Yes, yes, yes. So, well, you get the idea. This exercise works in, two different ways, two different benefits, and I think it also teaches your students to be spontaneous. Okay. Now, part two, this individual long turn. Let me just ask you a quick question. If I present you with these two, if you ask your students, especially teenagers, would you say that they always know what to say or sometimes lack ideas to talk about certain subjects? Yeah, so I think in an average group of 10 students, there's always one or two who can deal with all the questions. but a majority of them have no idea of what to say. Because, frankly speaking, when you're not an English teacher and you don't have a wide knowledge of everything, sometimes when you get a question like, what do you think about the environmental problems in the Amazon area, you really may have no idea. Because you don't really care about the Amazon area so much. And I think if you're a teenager, you really don't care about the Amazon area. My students have like no awareness of what's going on in our country, not to mention Brazil. That's why we need to remind them that in part two, when they have to talk on their own, which is perhaps also quite a stressful part of the examination, they don't really have to describe the photos, but talk about more general ideas. So if you look at these two photographs, the examiner always says what the photographs will show. The examiner always says that the students have to compare the photographs and say something else. So the structure of this examination is that, of this part, sorry, is that the student talks about these photographs for a minute, and then student B has a chance to respond for about 30 seconds. And in case your student or your students forget, the question is always on top of the examination paper with the pictures. So what I have found useful is that we have to remind our students to compare the ideas in the pictures. So as you can see, it's people who have succeeded in something. My experience with my students is that if we don't tell them that they have to compare, so find similarities and differences between these photographs, they will very often focus on the details. Okay, so lots of my students will just look at the photographs and say something like, wait, 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 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 7 people, in one photograph. 2 of them have red socks, and they get into the unnecessary details, which is not what's required in this examination. Okay, so we tell them once again that it's about finding similarities, finding differences, and commenting on uh, these pictures, like saying how you think the people are feeling. Okay, so realistically, when you have a minute to talk about 2 pictures that you have just seen for the first time, how many sentences do you think you can say in 1 minute as a student? Yeah, I think my experience is that it's about 5 or 6. Well, somebody wrote 45. I guess you have to be a very fast speaker, or it was meant to be like 4 or 5, I guess. Yes. So I guess it's about 5 or 6 sentences. So realistically, what you tell your students is that they have to find 2 things that the pictures have in common, 2 things in 2 aspects in which the pictures differ, and finally, give a short comment. Because our students, at least my students, very often start this part feeling that they have to say really like 45 sentences. And it's not 45, it's just, so you teach them the structure again. So you say that they have to start with both pictures show, then mention 1 or 2 similarities, then say, but the pictures also differ in certain aspects, and they mention 1 or 2 differences. And then finally, they give this short comment. Okay? So does this make sense to you? Yeah, thank you. And also, don't know about your languages, but again, Polish students come up with all sorts of different prepositions for the pictures, but it's not in, because in Polish it's more like on the picture. So they say something like on, add, by, etc. But you have to stress time and time again that in English it's always in the picture. Yeah, same in Serbian. Good news. So keep struggling. Ukrainian, same, great, keep struggling. So we're all struggling. But this expression is like 100% bound to appear in the exam because they will talk about the pictures. So it only makes sense to say that, it's always in the picture. Okay? Also, when the other student has to say something about those pictures, it's about 30 seconds. So you have to stress to your students that one short answer will not do. Let me just go back to the previous slide. Okay. If student B has to say how answer this question, like how do you normally celebrate success? Answering with something like by having a party will not do. So you need to stress to your students that the follow-up question has got like 30 seconds for the answer, which is really a lot of time. And if you remember discourse management, the extent will also matter. So stress it to your students that it's really important that they develop this answer well appropriately. Okay, I can see that some of you are having nice little chats, but I think the good news is that the attendee count is still rising, so no one has left the building, which is great. Thank you very much. Okay. Now, one little tip, one little exercise for your students, because most of you, like 93% of you, typed that your students sometimes lack ideas, is you split and divide this part into three students. So instead of having one student who will compare and comment on this task, you divide them into groups of three. So you look at these pictures, which I prepared myself because, St. Valentine's Day is so close, joke intended, and your students work in groups of three. And they perform this individual long-term together as if they were one person. So student A has to find two or three similarities. Like, there are hearts in both pictures. Uh, both pictures have been taken with water in the background, and so on and so forth. Now, student B student 2 has to find two or three differences, and finally, student C has to say which picture is a better representation of love. And this is the question you can answer now. So, which picture is a better representation of love? The swans or the people? Yeah, you see, it's hard to choose. And when you say it's hard to choose, this also leads me uh, to one more thing. You have to stress it to your students that when somebody asks them the question, like, what's your favorite film? What's your favorite book? The examiner is not really asking them to decide, like, right here, right now, about their number one favorite film, but it's just say something about a film you like. Because again, many of my students struggle with this idea, like whether they prefer The Shining or The Game, and they spend about 30 seconds deciding without actually giving the answer. So once again, stress it to your student that whenever the question is something that's hard to choose, they should just say anything about the given subject. Would it make sense to you? Yeah. And I think I think it's only natural to be surprised by some of those pictures because especially with teenage students, but adults as well, these photographs in the exam are not always as stimulating to the mind as my uh, images of love. Okay, this is perhaps the last joke today or not. We'll see. Okay, so the idea is that uh, I have seen pictures of, for example, two different rivers. And now, when you're a teenager and you have to compare two different rivers, you can understand and you can sort of predict that they're not going to be too enthusiastic because, honestly, when was the last time anyone asked you to compare two rivers? Yeah. So we have to stress it to our students that it's not really about the details; it's more about the general. Never, long ago. Okay, good for you. Don't remember. Yeah, I think it's actually a quite an unnatural task by itself. Because in a moment we're going to move to part three, which is negotiating some kind of solution. And well, we negotiate solutions every day in real life, but we don't really compare and contrast photographs. When you have friends over for dinner, you invite them in. You don't really sit them down and give them two photographs of your holiday and say, now you have a minute to compare them, do you? No, this is great because if you do, this means that your only friends are English teachers, and it might be time to make some changes in your life. Okay, so let's move on. One more piece of advice for this part is that when your students have nothing to say personally, they have no experience, you can tell them this simple trick that every question that they get in the exam, any question they hear anywhere else, can be answered on three different levels: the global level, the local level, and the personal level. So if you think about these two images, for example, and well, both pictures show people spending time outside. When your students have no idea of what to say, they can think about the global perspective, like the countries, the areas of the world where people spend more time outside. They can compare spending time outside with a group or when you're alone. Or they can think about the same question sort of locally. So, what's the most popular thing to do in their country, in their area? And finally, on a personal level. So when you think about these three levels, even if you say just one sentence about every level, this will surely fill in this 1 minute in which you have to speak on your own. So this way you will always have something to say. And I think I found this quite useful because most of my students, many of my teenage students, very often say something like, "I have no idea. I have never experienced this." But when you think about, the trends, the tendencies in your country, in the world, it's always a bit easier. Okay. So part three is the sort of, collaborative task. And now, here is a question. Do your students sometimes have difficulty maintaining eye contact with the other candidate? Yeah, so it's mostly yes, so useful. Yes, yes, thank you. Okay. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few things in this exam in this part. As you can see, uh, students have to solve a task together, and they have 2 minutes for this. And it's important to stress it to them that at this point, they don't have to make a decision. It's just 2 minutes to talk about these different aspects, like the good and the bad parts of doing these different jobs, for example. Okay, so it's 2 minutes just to talk about the aspect. Realistically, when you have 2 minutes, you won't be able to talk about all of them, but as long as you keep getting there, then perhaps, well, you still get marks. One thing, there is no task achievement mark in the exam, which means that even if your students don't finish this task or any other, but they keep getting there, but they just don't have enough time to finish what they say, they can still get full marks and, well, no problem about that, which I think is good news. Okay, so after 2 minutes of the interaction, the examiner will ask another question. And this time they have 1 minute. Now decide which of these jobs would be most difficult to do without help from other people. And that's where they have to make a decision in about 1 minute, which I think is really, really good news here. Because many students leave the examination room and come back to us and say, "Oh, teacher, Miss or Mrs. That, I forgot to say this, we didn't manage to finish that part, and so on. Am I going to pass the exam? Is it the end of the world or what?" And of course, the good news is you have to stress it to your students that they can get full marks when they keep getting there. Now, on the other hand, this doesn't mean that they can say anything about anything, okay? So even if they discuss, let's say, two or three of these uh, subjects, it's still enough. But if they deviate from the subject and start talking about something else, well, this is definitely not welcome in the examination. Okay, so once again, this part is divided into two. So we've got 2 minutes to talk about these different aspects of everything, and then 1 minute to make a certain decision. And at this level, sorry, at this stage of the exam, your students will have to uh, make suggestions, so interact between uh, themselves and the other candidate, which means that they have to agree and disagree and negotiate. And I think many of my students sometimes prefer the easy way and they just say yes to everything the other person is saying. Whereas I think it's more creative to disagree from time to time. Now, would you say that your students are generally too dominant or too quiet in examinations? Quiet Estonians are like that. I would say quiet Poles as well. So you have to make it clear to your student that they can improve their interactive communication marks. For example, if your students are quite shy and they come across somebody who's dominant, they have to make attempts to say something. So they have to learn strategies. You have to teach them strategies to interact with the other person. So all these expressions, such as "I'm sorry to break in, but I'd like to say something," "Sorry, can I just add something," etc., etc. This is very important, and I think it's very often neglected while preparing our students for the exam. And you will find lots of different tips and tricks like this in the Straight to First book. So all those little things you can do to help your students succeed. And as I said at the beginning, that's why I've always liked working with Roy Norris's books, because not only do they teach language, but also contain many of these little tips and tricks that can make taking this examination much easier. Okay. So if students are shy, as I said, uh, they have to learn ways to break in. If they're dominant, they also have to learn to control themselves. And I'm going to provide you with a few ideas in a moment. It's important to let them know that they don't have to agree with everything the other person is saying, even if they don't reach a conclusion in the second part of this stage, where they have to decide which of these jobs would be the most difficult. And even if at the end of this part they say, well, we couldn't decide because I believe this, my friend believes that, it's also okay. As I said, as long as they keep getting there, it's still all right. So perhaps one clue for your students might be to tell them the first thing they do when they get the paper for part three is to start looking at each other. Okay? Do your students have problems with maintaining eye contact? Yes, you said yes. My students very often, when they get the task, they don't look at each other, but they look at the paper. So student A looks at the paper, talks to the paper, and then hopes that the answer will sort of come back. Okay, which I think is horrible because if you have like two people of the same age, the first thing they do, the first thing I tell my students is face the chairs so that you have to see each other. Okay, this way you force yourself to look at the other person, which forces you to be more communicative, which in the end may improve your marks for this part, which I found very useful. Just a slight movement of the chairs can do the trick. So. On the one hand, they don't maintain eye contact. On the other hand, some of them may sort of like have this eye contact where they keep staring at the other person, which is, well, a bit creepy to say the least. But if anything, most of my students sort of communicate through the paper, and this is not the right way to communicate. Okay, so now you have to tell them that if they have no idea of what to say in this part, they can also build up on what the other person is saying. So if the partner is saying something, they can also add something. They can develop their partner's answers, which, as you saw in the discourse management description, is a very important skill as well. Okay. Now, one thing that your students can do to dominate, to find out if they dominate or if they shy away from conversation, is record themselves. Now, if you teach teenage students, would you say that the mobile phone has become the extension of their hand and they sort of can't let go, like Facebook all the time, Instagram updates? Yes. Yeah, and I think, most mobile phones these days have this recording function. So what I do with my students is that when I teach a group, I put them in pairs, I put them in different corners so that they can't really hear each other. Yeah, I can see comments like they don't like it, which is, great because, well, they don't have to like it, but it's very effective. And you have to tell your students why you're doing it, which will not make them like this task, but at least they will be able to see something. For example, I did this exercise 2 weeks ago because my students are now preparing to take the first exam at the beginning of March, and I asked them to record uh, themselves doing this part together. Then I asked them to listen to it again and look at the watches and see who was the dominant person and who was the shy person. And this way, I think, as you can see, this could be homework, as you're saying, which is great. And this is the right way of using mobile phones. Because this way they can find out if they tend to dominate the discussion or if they tend to shy away. So it's better for them to find out something about uh, how they handle communication, how they handle interaction in class, rather than find out when they get well their marks, because no one will tell them. If you don't tell them, no one will tell them that they have to either learn to break in and say something if the other person is too dominant, or if they have to learn to control themselves if they tend to become too dominant. Okay, okay. So as you can see, some people choose, well, nice comment with that Game of Thrones from your students, by the way. So yes, videos will work as well. So I've found that my students are quite sensitive about their image of the face, and they prefer to record just the audio, not the video. But if your students are quite open, you can record the video as well, and this way they can find out if they dominate or step back from the discussion. Okay, and one little trick that you can practice with your students if they have this tendency not to look at each other but they look at the examination paper is you put them in a circle, in a full circle, and you ask them to work in pairs and answer certain questions. When you say something like change, they have to look at the person on the other side and talk to this person. You say change, they move away and they start talking to another person. Because this way, this will force them to look at the other person. And I would say that it's a simple trick. It starts with, moving the chair, then you get to something like looking at the other person, which is very, very basic, but it forces you to communicate with this other person. So I think that all the exercises that we do, all the tricks that we do, have to be very simple, very doable. And I think this is just, well, very doable. You may not have a classroom equipped with everything, you may need, but we all have chairs, at least here. Okay, and finally, part four, which, as I said at the beginning, is an extension of part three. So the subject is quite similar sometimes, and students will get questions from the examiner. And now the important thing about this part is that you teach your students to extend their answers again, because if you look at the first question, what kind of films do you like best and why? Why is the prompt. So your students should ideally be able to answer this question without being prompted. And once again, the magic phrase, which films do you like best? It's not really about making the decision like right here, right now, whether it's thrillers or horrors, but it's about saying anything about any films that you like. Okay? And you can also try the same activity as we practiced at the beginning with part one. What's your point? So student A gets the questions and has to answer them. Student B has to listen to the answers and write down what the questions were. So you can recycle this. Your students have to stick to the subject and also have to extend the questions so that the other person can guess what the question is. Of course, at this level, we expect student B, who has to guess what the questions were, we expect this student to try and guess as much of the question as possible. So if it's something like what kind of films do you like? Well, you can say it's close, but what kind of film do you like best is the perfect question. Okay. One interesting thing about this is that the expected interaction pattern for this part is the examiner asks the candidate, the two candidates, the questions in turn, which means that the first question is, for example, for candidate one, but candidate two has to listen carefully because sometimes they will be asked a prompt like, "And what do you think about the same subject?" Or "Is there anything you disagree?" So they have to listen carefully. Of course, the questions will vary and the follow-up questions will vary as well, but there's one little trick you can teach your students at this level. If student one gets the first question from the examiner, he or she can turn to the other student when they have finished and say, "And what do you think?" This is not the the usual pattern in the examination, but this is like the final chance for your students to improve their interactive communication marks. Because this way, when they turn to their partner, first of all, they show that they're communicative, they really care about the other person's opinion, and they also leave like a nice final impression at the end of the examination. What's great about this tip is also that candidate two, who may have misunderstood the question, has had enough time to think about the answer. And you know that there's probably nothing worse than not understanding the question at the end of the exam and leaving the exam with one question you failed to answer. So once again, you might think that you failed the whole exam, which of course is not true. But this will leave like a lasting impression on your student. I think it's better this way if we can leave the examination room, you know, with this great final impression that, we have been successful. Okay. So before we say goodbye, I would like to make some comments. Now, as you can see, this is a picture of the area where I come from. And this also sends a very important message to our students because I think the practical upshot of what I've been trying to tell you is that you have to teach your students like what is tested in the exam. You have to tell them everything that they will be required to do. But at the same time, this has to be spontaneous. I know it's a difficult balance to strike between practicing something and like rehearsing something a lot and also being spontaneous. Okay, so I would like you to look at these two images and well, I have tried to use this certain metaphor that straight, like when you want to prepare your students like straight to straight to the examination success, it doesn't mean that you have to use a straight jacket. Okay, now that was a linguistic joke and perhaps the last one today. Okay, which means that everything you teach your students has to be, well, the meanings we teach have to be conveyed in such a way that they know that it's still, supposed to be spontaneous interaction. So there's a difference between, rehearsing, learning by heart. Okay, so straight doesn't mean straitjacket. If your students come up with an idea during the exam which they haven't rehearsed, they can still use this idea. They can still be spontaneous because when they're at B2 level, it's not about a rehearsed interaction, it's about spontaneous interaction. Okay, so the balance we're sort of trying to achieve here is between practice, rehearsal, and spontaneity at the same time. Okay? So I guess we have like 5 minutes for a question or two. Yeah, there's a question if it's okay to, well, calm down the dominant students because they can be aggressive. Yes, it's very important to tell them that they shouldn't be aggressive. Uh, Okay, so and yeah, so you have to tell them that they can't dominate the discussion because they lose marks. Because some of them might think that it's a chance to say something more. Well, this isn't a way to say something more. It's basically, well, like a straight way to be penalized. Okay, so I would say that yes, please do tell your students that they can't dominate this discussion. Okay. I'm getting questions about the author of the book. So it's Roy Norris. So you'll find the Straight for First and also Straight for Advanced book. Both of them follow more or less the same pattern. I found both of them quite useful. I have one more question for you, which I would like you to answer. Just give me a moment to type it in. Okay. So thank you very much for this experience. This has been great. I'm going to look at the whole transcript of the conversation. It seems that, yes, there was one person with us who isn't an English teacher and who got here by mistake. Thank you very much for surviving with us. We don't know what you did and how much you enjoyed this session, but we hope this was great. Okay, so I guess it's bye-bye and see you sometime, somewhere in my country or somewhere in one of your beautiful countries. Bye.